The rain hammered against Linda Morrison's kitchen window as she stared at her phone, her 63-year-old hands trembling slightly. The text message from her son David glowed accusingly on the screen. "Mom, I need you to back off. I can handle my own kids." Linda set the phone down and looked at the lasagna she'd prepared enough for 4 people. As always, it was Tuesday, which meant David would be working late at the auto repair shop, and 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Jake would be home alone again. She'd been making these meals for 3 months now, ever since David's wife Sarah had packed her bags and left without a word. The house felt too quiet without her late husband Robert's presence. He'd passed away just 18 months ago, leaving Linda to navigate this new reality alone. But when David needed help, she'd stepped up without hesitation. That's what family did. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Emma calling from David's house across town, Grandma Linda. Emma's small voice cracked through the speaker. "Daddy's not home yet, and Jake is really hungry. We looked in the fridge, but there's only beer and some old pizza." Linda's heart clenched. "Sweetheart, I'm coming over right now. Can you stay on the phone with me?" "Okay," Emma whispered. "Jake's crying because his tummy hurts." Linda grabbed her purse and the lasagna, her mind racing. This was the 4th time this month she'd received calls like this. David was drowning, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Every time she tried to help, he pushed back harder. The drive to David's modest ranch house took 15 minutes through the winding streets of Millbrook, Ohio. The neighborhood had seen better days, paint peeling from siding, yards overgrown with weeds, and streetlights flickering intermittently. David's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. Its blue paint faded to a grayish hue. Linda used her spare key to enter, calling out softly, "Emma, Jake, it's Grandma." 2 small figures rushed toward her from the living room. Emma, tall for her age with David's dark hair and serious brown eyes, wrapped her arms around Linda's waist. Jake, blonde like his absent mother with freckles scattered across his nose, buried his face against her hip. "We were scared," Emma admitted, looking up at Linda. "Daddy said he'd be home by 6, but it's almost 8. The house told a story Linda wished she couldn't read. Dishes piled in the sink, laundry overflowing from baskets, and homework assignments scattered across the coffee table. The refrigerator hummed loudly, its surface covered with overdue bills and school notices. "Let's get you both fed," Linda said, carrying the lasagna to the kitchen. As she heated portions in the microwave, she noticed the children's school clothes from yesterday crumpled on the floor. "Grandma, can you help me with my math homework?" Emma asked, sliding onto a bar stool. "I don't understand the word problems." "Of course, sweetheart." Linda set the steaming plates before them and pulled out Emma's workbook. The problems were advanced for 2nd grade, but Emma was bright. She just needed someone to guide her through the logic. Jake ate quietly, his small hands struggling with the fork. Linda noticed a bruise on his arm and gently asked about it. "I fell off my bike," he said matter-of-factly. "Daddy was fixing Mrs. Peterson's car and I was riding in the driveway. He didn't see me fall." The front door slammed, and David's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Linda's stomach tightened. She could hear the exhaustion in his walk, the way his work boots dragged against the hardwood floor. "Mom." David's voice carried a sharp edge. "What are you doing here?" David appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his oil-stained work clothes. At 32, he looked older than his years. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and something else. "The children called," Linda said calmly, continuing to help Jake cut his lasagna. "They were hungry." "I left them money for pizza," David snapped, running a hand through his dark hair. "They know how to order food." "David, they're 8 and 6, Linda replied, keeping her voice steady. They shouldn't have to, what, learn to be independent?" David's voice rose. "I'm their father, Mom. I can take care of my own kids." Emma and Jake exchanged glances, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Linda recognized the look they'd seen this argument before. "I know you can," Linda said softly. "I'm just trying to help." "I don't need your help," David shot back. "I need you to stop treating me like I'm incompetent." The tension in the room was suffocating. Linda looked at her grandchildren, seeing the fear in their eyes. This wasn't the first time they'd witnessed their father's anger, and it wouldn't be the last. "Daddy, please don't yell," Emma said quietly. "Grandma Linda just brought us dinner." David's expression softened slightly as he looked at his daughter, but the hardness returned when his gaze shifted back to Linda. "I appreciate the food, Mom, but I can handle dinner. I can handle everything." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I need you to back off?" Linda felt the words like a physical blow. After everything she'd done, the meals, the rides to school when David couldn't make it, the help with homework, this was how he repaid her. "I'm not trying to interfere," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying to help my grandchildren. Well, stop, David said flatly. They're not your responsibility. They're mine. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda looked at Emma and Jake, both staring at their plates, and felt her heart break a little more. She'd lost her husband, and now she was losing her family. Fine, Linda said, standing up. She kissed the tops of Emma and Jake's heads, whispering that she loved them. Call me if you need anything, she told David, though she knew he wouldn't. As she drove home through the rain-soaked streets, Linda couldn't shake the image of her grandchildren's faces. They looked so small, so vulnerable. And David, her only child, had looked at her like she was the enemy. Back in her empty house, Linda sat at her kitchen table and opened a notebook. She'd been keeping it since Sarah left, jotting down observations about the children's well-being. Tonight, she wrote, Tuesday, November 3rd. Children home alone until 8 p.m. No proper food in house. Emma struggling with homework. Jake has unexplained bruise on arm. David hostile to offers of help. She didn't know why she was documenting these things. Maybe it was the teacher in her she'd spent 30 years in elementary education before retiring. Maybe it was maternal instinct. Or maybe, deep down, she knew that someday, someone would need to know the truth about what was happening to Emma and Jake. 3 days later, Linda's phone rang at 2 a.m. The caller ID showed Emma's number. David's old phone that he'd given her for emergencies. Grandma. Emma's voice was thick with tears. Jake's really sick, and Daddy won't wake up. He's on the couch, and he smells funny. I don't know what to do. Linda was already reaching for her keys. I'm coming, sweetheart. Stay with Jake, and don't try to wake Daddy. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The drive felt eternal. Linda's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. When she arrived at David's house, she found the front door unlocked. Detail that made her stomach turn. Emma met her at the door, still in her pajamas. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. He's in the bathroom, Emma whispered, leading Linda down the hallway. Linda found Jake hunched over the toilet, vomiting. His forehead was burning with fever, and his small body shook with chills. She immediately called their pediatrician's after-hours line while Emma hovered nearby. We need to get him to the emergency room, Linda told Emma after speaking with the nurse. Can you get dressed quickly? As they prepared to leave, Linda glanced toward the living room where David lay unconscious on the couch. Empty beer bottles littered the coffee table, and the smell of alcohol hung heavy in the air. This wasn't the first time she'd seen him like this, but it was the first time the children had been left to deal with a medical emergency alone at the hospital. Jake was diagnosed with a severe stomach bug that required IV fluids. He was dehydrated, the doctor explained, and if they'd waited much longer, he could have been in serious trouble. Where's the father? The attending physician asked. He's not well, Linda said carefully. I'm the grandmother, the doctor's expression grew concerned. Has this child been properly cared for? He's underweight, and his dehydration suggests he hasn't been eating or drinking adequately. Linda felt the walls closing in. She couldn't lie to a medical professional, but she also couldn't bear to expose David's struggles. There have been some challenges at home recently. That night, as Jake slept in his hospital bed with Emma, curled up in a chair beside him, Linda made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her notebook and began to write, documenting every detail of the evening: the unlocked door, David's condition, Jake's illness, Emma's terror. She didn't want to be the grandmother who fought for custody. She wanted to be the grandmother who helped her son become a better father. But as she watched her grandchildren sleep in that sterile hospital room, Linda realized that sometimes wanting something and needing to do something were two very different things. The next morning, David arrived at the hospital looking haggard and ashamed. He hugged his children and thanked Linda for bringing Jake to the hospital, but he didn't apologize for his condition the night before. He didn't acknowledge that his children had been left to handle a medical emergency alone. This won't happen again, he mumbled, avoiding Linda's eyes. I hope not, Linda replied, but she kept writing in her notebook, because hoping wasn't enough anymore. 3 weeks after Jake's hospital visit, Linda Morrison sat in her car outside Millbrook Elementary School, watching the dismissal chaos unfold. Parents chatted in clusters while children streamed out of the building. But Linda's attention was fixed on the main entrance, waiting for Emma and Jake to appear. She'd been picking them up from school more often lately. David's work schedule had become increasingly erratic since he'd started taking on evening shifts at a second garage across town. He claimed he needed the extra money, but Linda suspected he was also avoiding the responsibilities waiting for him at home. Emma emerged first, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her face scanning the crowd. When she spotted Linda's silver Honda, relief washed over her features. Jake appeared moments later, his Star Wars lunchbox dragging behind him like a reluctant pet. Grandma Linda, Jake called out, breaking into a run. He threw himself into her arms with the enthusiasm that only 6-year-olds could muster. Easy there, Space Cadet. Linda laughed, ruffling his blonde hair. How was school today? Mrs. Patterson says I'm really good at reading, Jake beamed. She gave me a harder book to take home. Emma approached more slowly, her expression troubled. Grandma, I forgot my lunch money again today. I didn't eat anything except the crackers from the nurse's office. Linda's heart sank. This was the 3rd time this month. What about the lunch your dad packed? He didn't pack one, Emma said quietly. He was already gone when we woke up. Linda made a mental note and helped the children into her car. As they drove toward David's house, she listened to their chatter about school events, friends, and upcoming assignments. Emma mentioned a science fair project due next week, and Jake talked excitedly about the class field trip to the zoo. Has your dad signed the permission slip for the zoo trip? Linda asked, glancing at Jake in the rearview mirror. Jake's face fell. I forgot to give it to him. It's in my backpack somewhere. We'll find it when we get home, Linda assured him. But she was already calculating deadlines. The trip was in 4 days, and if David didn't sign the slip soon, Jake would miss out. At David's house, Linda unlocked the door with her spare key. The smell hit her immediately. Stale beer, unwashed, dishes, and something else she couldn't identify. The living room was worse than she'd seen it in weeks. Fast food containers covered the coffee table. Laundry was piled on every surface, and homework papers were scattered across the floor. I'm hungry, Jake announced, heading straight for the kitchen. Linda followed him, already knowing what she'd find. The refrigerator contained expired milk, takeout containers of questionable age, and a 6-pack of beer. The pantry offered little more stale cereal, peanut butter, and half a loaf of bread. Grandma, can we have the sandwiches you made yesterday? Emma asked, hopefully. Of course, sweetheart. Linda had started keeping a cooler in her car with snacks and simple meals. She'd told herself it was just temporary, until David got back on his feet, but temporary was stretching into months. While the children ate, Linda quietly moved through the house, picking up trash and organizing the chaos. She found Jake's zoo permission slip crumpled under the couch cushions, along with several unpaid bills and a notice from Emma's teacher about missing homework assignments. Emma, honey, what's this about missing homework? Linda asked, showing her the notice. Emma's cheeks flushed red. I did it, but I couldn't find my folder to turn it in. Everything's so messy here, and Daddy gets mad when I ask for help organizing. My stuff. Linda felt that familiar knot in her stomach tighten. She pulled out her phone and discreetly took a photo of the teacher's notice, then added it to a folder she'd been building on her phone. The folder contained dozens of images, now photos of empty refrigerators, overdue bills, and the children's living conditions. Every photo felt like a betrayal of David, but Linda couldn't ignore what she was seeing. The children were suffering, and David was either too overwhelmed or too proud to accept that he needed help. Let's get your homework organized, Linda said, helping Emma sort through the papers scattered on the dining room table. They found math worksheets, reading assignments, and a science project that was due the next day. I don't understand this science stuff, Emma admitted, staring at the worksheet about the water cycle. I asked Daddy to help me, but he said he was too tired. Linda sat beside her granddaughter and began explaining evaporation and condensation. Using simple analogies, Emma was bright. She grasped concepts quickly when someone took the time to explain them. But she was falling behind because she didn't have consistent support at home. Jake finished his sandwich and wandered over to them. Grandma, can you help me with my reading book? It's really hard, of course, sweetheart. Linda opened Jake's backpack and found his reading log, which was 3 weeks behind. The teacher had noted that Jake was capable of reading at grade level but wasn't completing his assignments. As Linda helped Jake sound out difficult words, she noticed Emma struggling to stay awake over her math homework. It was only 6 o'clock, but the girl looked exhausted. When did you go to bed last night? Linda asked gently. I don't know, Emma yawned. Daddy came home really late, and he was watching TV in the living room. It was really loud and Jake was scared, so I let him sleep in my bed, but he kicks a lot. Linda's phone buzzed with a text from David, working late again. Kids can handle dinner themselves, back around midnight. Linda stared at the message, feeling a surge of frustration. David was working late every night now, leaving the children to fend for themselves. She texted back, I'm here with them. They need help with homework and a proper dinner. His response came quickly. I told you to back off, Mom. They're fine. But they weren't fine. Linda could see it in Emma's tired eyes, in Jake's anxious fidgeting, in the way both children clung to her whenever she arrived. They were resilient, but they were also 8 and 6 years old. They needed stability, routine, and adult supervision. Grandma, will you stay until Daddy gets home? Jake asked, climbing onto her lap. I'll stay as long as you need me, Linda promised. Though she knew David would be angry when he found her there, she helped the children finish their homework, then supervised their baths and bedtime routines. David's house had no structure, no set bedtime, no regular meal times, no homework schedule. The children were adapting as best they could, but Linda could see the stress in their behavior. Emma had developed a nervous habit of chewing her fingernails, and Jake had started wetting the bed against something he hadn't done since he was 4. These were signs of anxiety, signs that the children were struggling to cope with their unstable home environment. At 9 o'clock, Linda tucked both children into their beds. Emma's room was relatively clean, but Jake's room was chaos everywhere, toys scattered across the floor, and sheets that hadn't been changed in weeks. "Grandma, will you read us a story?" Jake asked, holding up a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. Linda settled into the chair between their beds and began to read. The familiar words seemed to calm both children, and within minutes they were asleep. She kissed their foreheads and whispered goodnight, then returned to the living room to wait for David. While she waited, Linda pulled out her notebook and began to document the evening. She wrote about the missing lunch money, the incomplete homework, the children's exhaustion, and David's text message. She photographed the empty refrigerator and the overdue bills on the counter. Each entry felt like evidence in a case she didn't want to build. But Linda couldn't ignore the pattern she was seeing. The children's needs were being neglected, and David was either unable or unwilling to address the problems. At 12:30 a.m., David's truck pulled into the driveway. Linda heard him stumble on the front steps, and when he entered the house, she could smell alcohol on his breath. "Mom, what are you still doing here?" David asked, his words slightly slurred. "The children needed help with homework and dinner," Linda replied calmly. "They were asking for you." David collapsed onto the couch, still wearing his work clothes. "I'm doing the best I can. Work is crazy right now, and I need the overtime." "David, Emma didn't have lunch money today. Jake's reading log is 3 weeks behind. They're struggling." "They're fine," David insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Kids are resilient. I was working at their age." Linda wanted to argue, to point out that David had never been left alone at 8 years old, that he'd had 2 parents and a stable home, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged with defeat. "Let me help you," she said softly. "I can. Take them to school in the mornings, help with homework, make sure they have proper meals. You don't have to do this alone." David's expression hardened. "I can take care of my own kids." "But you're not," Linda said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "You're not taking care of them, David. They're taking care of themselves." The silence that followed was electric with tension. David stared at his mother, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. "Get out," he said quietly, "of her son." She gathered her purse and jacket, then paused at the door. "And if you can't be what they need, then maybe what?" David stood up, swaying slightly. "Maybe you should ask yourself if you're doing right by them." She left without another word, driving home through the empty streets with her heart breaking. David had kicked her out. He'd chosen his pride over his children's well-being, and there was nothing she could do about it. Or was there? Linda looked at her phone, at the folder of photos she'd been building, spent alone. She didn't want to be the grandmother who fought her son in court. She wanted to be the grandmother who helped her family heal. But sometimes wanting something and needing to do something were 2 very different things that night. She sat at her kitchen table with her notebook, documenting everything she could remember about the past few months: the missed parent-teacher conferences, the times the children had called her crying, the nights David had been too intoxicated to care for them properly. She was building a case against her own son, and it felt like the worst kind of betrayal. But every time she thought about stopping, she remembered Emma's face when she'd found her and Jake alone and scared. She remembered Jake's fever and David's unconscious form on the couch. The children needed an advocate, and Linda was the only one willing to fight for them, even if it meant fighting her own son. Linda Morrison hadn't heard from David in 2 weeks. 2 weeks of silence, 2 weeks of wondering if Emma and Jake were okay, 2 weeks of driving past their school and resisting the urge to check on them. David had made his position clear. She was no longer welcome in their lives, but children have a way of finding the adults they need, even when those adults are forbidden from reaching out. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, while Linda was grading papers for the literacy program she volunteered with at the local community center. Emma's number flashed on her phone screen, and Linda's heart immediately began racing. "Grandma Linda." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. Linda asked, already reaching for her car keys. He hit his head really hard, and they took him to the nurse. The nurse called Daddy, but he didn't answer. They called him like 10 times, and now they're saying they might call someone else if he doesn't come get Jake. Linda was already in her car, backing out of her driveway. He says it hurts really bad and he threw up on the nurse's desk. I'm coming. To get you both, Linda said, speeding toward the school. Stay with Jake and tell the nurse that Grandma Linda is on her way. But Daddy said, don't worry about what Daddy said. Flashers still blinking as she parked in the visitor space. She hurried to the main office, his face pale and a large purple bruise forming on his forehead. Emma sat beside him, holding his hand and looking terrified. Oh, sweetheart, Linda breathed, rushing to Jake's side. How are you feeling? My head hurts really bad, Grandma, Jake whimpered, and I feel sick. The school nurse, Mrs. Chen, approached with a clipboard and a concerned expression. Are you the grandmother? I'm glad someone came. We've been trying to reach the father for over an hour. What happened? Linda asked, gently stroking Jake's hair. Given the size of the bump and the fact that he vomited, I'm concerned about a possible concussion. He needs to be seen by a doctor immediately. Linda didn't hesitate. I'll take him to the emergency room right now. I need to see some identification and confirm you're authorized to pick up the children, Mrs. Chen said, though her tone suggested she was trying to help rather than create obstacles. Linda showed her driver's license and explained the situation as diplomatically as possible. The father is working and apparently not able to answer his phone. I'm the children's grandmother and I've been their emergency contact in the past. Mrs. Chen glanced at Emma, who was watching the adult conversation with anxious eyes. Emma, honey, is this your grandmother? Yes, ma'am. She takes care of us when Daddy's working. That seemed to be enough for Mrs. Chen. She helped Linda gather the children's belongings and provided detailed notes about Jake's injury for the hospital. Staff. At the emergency room, Linda held Jake's hand while he underwent a CT scan. The waiting room was filled with the usual mix of patients crying babies, elderly people with worried family members, and accident victims like Jake. Emma sat pressed against Linda's side, her small body trembling with residual fear. Is Jake going to be okay? She asked for the 10th time. The doctors are going to take very good care of him, Linda assured her. Head injuries can be scary, but Jake is strong and brave. While they waited for results, Linda tried calling David repeatedly. Each call went straight to voicemail, where she left increasingly urgent messages explaining the situation. She couldn't understand how a father could be unreachable when his child was in the hospital. Dr. Martinez, a young emergency physician with kind eyes, eventually came to speak with them. Jake has a mild concussion, he explained. The CT scan shows no bleeding or swelling, which is good news, but he'll need to be monitored closely over the next 24 to 48 hours. What does that mean? Linda asked. Someone needs to wake him every few hours tonight to check his responsiveness. If he becomes increasingly drowsy, confused, or starts vomiting again, he needs to come back immediately. Do you have experience with concussion care? Linda nodded. I was a teacher for 30 years. I've dealt with head injuries before. Good. I'm going to discharge him to your care, but I need to speak with his father first. Is he available? Linda's stomach dropped. He's not answering his phone. He's at work. Dr. Martinez frowned. I'll keep trying, Linda said. Though she was beginning to suspect that David might be avoiding her calls deliberately, they waited another hour before David finally arrived, looking harried and smelling faintly of alcohol. Linda noticed his bloodshot eyes and the way he swayed slightly when he walked. Where's Jake? He demanded, barely acknowledging Linda's presence. He's been waiting for you for 3 hours, Linda said quietly. He has a concussion, David. He needs to be monitored. Overnight? David looked at his son, who was drowsy from pain medication, but alert enough to reach for his father. Daddy, my head hurts, Jake said pitifully. I know, buddy. Daddy's here now. David's voice softened when he spoke to Jake, and Linda saw a glimpse of the caring father she knew he could be. Dr. Martinez approached with discharge papers and detailed instructions. Mr. Morrison, Jake has a mild concussion. He needs to be woken every 3 hours tonight for neurological checks. If he becomes increasingly confused, starts vomiting, or has difficulty staying awake, bring him back immediately. David nodded, but Linda could see he was barely processing the information. She stepped forward. Doctor, what exactly should we look for during these checks? Dr. Martinez explained the signs and symptoms to watch for, and Linda took careful notes. She could see David's attention wandering, his eyes drooping with fatigue or intoxication. Dad, can you repeat back what the doctor just said? Emma asked, quietly, her 8-year-old intuition picking up on the adult's tension. David struggled to summarize the instructions, getting several key points wrong. Dr. Martinez looked concerned. Perhaps the grandmother should stay with you tonight to help monitor Jake, the doctor suggested. That's not necessary, David said. Quickly, I can handle it. Linda felt a surge of panic. David could barely stand upright, and he was supposed to monitor a child with a head injury. David, I think it would be best if I said I can handle it, David snapped, his voice carrying across the emergency room. Other families turned to stare, and Linda felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Dr. Martinez pulled Linda aside while a nurse finished Jake's discharge paperwork. I'm concerned about the father's ability to provide appropriate care tonight. Are there other family members who could help? I'm the only other family, Linda said quietly, but he's asked me not to be involved. This is a medical situation. The child's safety comes first. Dr. Martinez handed her a card. If you have any concerns about Jake's care tonight, please don't hesitate to call or bring him back. Linda tucked the card into her purse, knowing she'd likely need it before morning. The drive to David's house was tense and silent. David followed Linda's car, driving slowly and carefully in a way that suggested he knew he shouldn't be behind the wheel. Emma and Jake sat quietly in Linda's back seat, both exhausted from the day's events. At the house, Linda helped Jake to the couch while David disappeared into the kitchen. She could hear him opening a beer and her heart sank. He was planning to drink while monitoring a child with a head injury. David, you can't drink tonight, Linda said firmly. Jake needs to be checked every 3 hours. You need to be alert. I'm fine, David slurred slightly. 1 beer won't hurt. 1 beer on top of whatever you had before you came to the hospital, Linda countered. You're in no condition to care for a child with a concussion. David's face darkened. You're not staying here, Mom. I told you then. I'm taking the children to my house, Linda said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Jake needs proper care, and you're not capable of providing it right now. You're not taking my kids anywhere, David said, stepping closer to her. Linda could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the rage building in his eyes. Emma and Jake watched from the living room, their faces pale with fear. Linda realized they'd seen this before there. Father's anger, his drinking, his inability to care for them when they needed him most. Please don't fight, Emma whispered. Jake's head really hurts. Linda looked at her granddaughter, seeing the exhaustion and fear in her young face. This 8-year-old was trying to mediate between adults, trying to protect her little brother while their father chose alcohol over their well-being. I'm calling Mrs. Chen, Linda said, pulling out her phone. She can verify that I'm authorized to care for the children in medical emergencies. You're not taking my kids, David repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. Linda was already dialing. Then prove you can take care of them. Put the beer down and show me you can provide the care Jake needs. David stared at the beer in his hand, then at his children's faces. For a moment, Linda thought he might make the right choice, but then he set the beer on the counter and glared at her. Get out, he said quietly. Take the kids if you want, but this is the last time. I'm done with your interference. Linda felt something break inside her chest. David, I mean it, Mom. After tonight, you're out of our lives permanently. Linda looked at her son, really looked at him. She saw the man who'd once been a loving father, who'd called her every Sunday and brought the children over for family dinners. But she also saw the stranger he'd become, someone who put his pride above his children's safety. Fine, she said quietly, but I'm documenting all of this. Every missed call, every time you chose alcohol over your children, every moment you put them in danger. David's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me? I'm protecting them, Linda replied. Someone has to. She helped Jake to her car while Emma gathered their overnight clothes. As they drove to Linda's house, she made a decision that would change everything that night. While monitoring Jake's concussion symptoms, Linda called a family law attorney. She didn't want to fight David in court, but she couldn't watch her grandchildren suffer any longer. The attorney, Sarah Kim, listened to Linda's story with professional compassion. You have grounds for a custody petition, she said, particularly given the pattern of neglect and the father's inability to provide proper medical care. I don't want to take them away from him, Linda said. I want him to get help. Sometimes, legal intervention is the only way to motivate change, Sarah replied. We can ask the court for temporary custody while requiring the father to complete parenting classes and substance abuse treatment. Linda looked at Jake, sleeping peacefully. In her guest room with Emma curled up beside him, they looked so small, so vulnerable. They deserved better than what David was providing, and Linda was the only one who could give it to them. The next morning, Linda filed the paperwork for emergency temporary custody. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but as she watched, Emma helped Jake with his breakfast while carefully monitoring his concussion symptoms. She knew it was the right thing. The children didn't know what was coming. They thought they were just having an extended sleepover with Grandma Linda. But Linda knew that everything was about to change, and she prayed she was strong enough to see it through. The Hamilton County Family Court building stood like a fortress. of weathered brick and glass, its imposing facade doing nothing to calm Linda Morrison's nerves as she climbed the stone steps on a gray February morning. 3 months had passed since she'd filed for emergency temporary custody of Emma and Jake. 3 months of legal battles, social worker visits, and sleepless nights wondering if she'd made the right decision. Attorney Sarah Kim walked beside her, a leather briefcase in one hand and a reassuring presence at Linda's side. "Remember, we have a strong case," Sarah said quietly as they approached the main entrance. "The documentation you kept was thorough, and the children's welfare speaks for itself." Linda nodded, clutching her own folder of evidence photographs, school records, medical reports, and pages upon pages of her careful observations. Every piece of paper represented a moment when David had failed his children, and carrying that evidence felt like carrying David's failures on her shoulders. Inside the courthouse, the hallways buzzed with the controlled chaos of the legal system. Lawyers huddled with clients, families waited on hard benches, and court officers moved with practiced efficiency. Linda spotted David immediately. He sat alone on a bench outside courtroom 3, wearing an ill-fitting suit she didn't recognize, and staring at his hands. Her heart ached seeing him like that. Despite everything that had happened, despite the months of conflict and painful decisions, David was still her son. She remembered the little boy who'd skinned his knees learning to ride a bike, the teenager who'd called her from college just to hear her voice, Elle's defeat maybe, or resignation. "Mom," he said quietly, standing as she reached him. "David." Linda stopped a few feet away, uncertain how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. "Where are Emma and Jake?" David asked, looking around the hallway. "They're in school," Linda replied. "Sarah thought it would be better if they weren't here for this." David nodded, then looked at Sarah Kim with barely concealed resentment. "So, you're the lawyer trying to take my kids away?" "I'm the lawyer trying to protect your children," Sarah responded calmly. "There's a difference." Before David could respond, his own attorney appeared, a harried-looking public defender named Marcus Webb, who looked like he'd been assigned the case that morning. Linda had heard through Sarah that David couldn't afford private representation. Another sign of how far his life had spiraled. "Mr. Morrison, we need to talk before we go in," Webb said, steering David away from Linda and Sarah. Linda watched her son walk away and felt the weight of what they were about to do. In a few minutes they would all sit before a judge and argue about what was best for Emma and Jake. The children's future would be decided by strangers who'd never seen Jake's gap-toothed smile or Emma's fierce protectiveness of her little brother. Mrs. Morrison, a court officer, appeared at her elbow. "Judge Hoffman is ready to see you." Judge Patricia Hoffman was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. Her courtroom was small but dignified, with dark wood paneling and the seal of Ohio mounted behind her bench. Linda took her seat at the plaintiff's table while David sat across the aisle with his attorney. "This is a petition for emergency custody filed by Linda Morrison, maternal grandmother seeking temporary custody of minors Emma Morrison, age 8, and Jake Morrison, age 6, Judge Hoffman announced, consulting her notes. "The children are currently in Mrs. Morrison's care under an emergency order issued 3 months ago." Linda felt her palms sweating as Judge Hoffman continued. "I've reviewed the case file, including reports from Child Protective Services, the children's school, and their pediatrician. I've also read the guardian ad litem's recommendations." The guardian ad litem, Mrs. Rodriguez, had interviewed Emma and Jake separately the week before. Linda hadn't been allowed to be present, but Emma had told her afterward that the lady was nice and asked lots of questions about Daddy. "Ms. Kim, you may present your case," Judge Hoffman said. Sarah Kim stood, her posture confident but respectful. "Your Honor, this case is about 2 children who have been failed by their father's inability to provide basic care, supervision, and safety. Over the past year, these children have been neglected, endangered, and left to care for themselves. While their father struggled with alcohol abuse and depression, Sarah began presenting evidence methodically. She showed photographs of the empty refrigerator, the unpaid bills, the unsafe living conditions. She read excerpts from Linda's detailed journal, describing nights when David came home intoxicated, and mornings when the children were left to get themselves ready for school. On November 15th, 6-year-old Jake was hospitalized for severe dehydration while his father was unconscious on the couch. Sarah continued. On January 23rd, Jake suffered a concussion at school and his father was unreachable for over 3 hours. When Mr. Morrison finally arrived at the hospital, he was visibly intoxicated and unable to understand the medical instructions for his son's care. Linda listened to the litany of David's failures and felt sick. Each incident sounded even worse when presented as legal evidence, stripped of context and emotional nuance. But she couldn't deny the truth of what Sarah was saying. David had put his children at risk. repeatedly and willfully. Dr. Martinez from the emergency room testified via video conference, confirming that David had appeared intoxicated when he came to collect Jake and that he'd been unable to comprehend the concussion. Care instructions. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, testified about the child's frequent absences, missing homework, and signs of stress. Emma is a bright child, but she's been struggling academically this year, Mrs. Patterson explained. She's often tired, sometimes doesn't have lunch money, and has missed several important school events because her father didn't respond to permission slips or meeting requests. The school counselor, Mr. Garcia, testified about both children, showing signs of anxiety and emotional distress. Jake has been wetting the bed, which is unusual for a sick. Emma has developed nervous habits like nail biting and has taken on inappropriate responsibilities for her age, such as caring for her younger brother. With each witness, Linda watched David sink lower in his chair. His attorney made few objections, and Linda realized that Webb hadn't adequately prepared for the case. David was being represented by someone who barely knew his story, while Sarah had spent months building an airtight case. The most damaging testimony came from Lisa Chen, the social worker who'd been monitoring the family since Linda's petition was filed. In my professional opinion, Mr. Morrison is currently unable to provide adequate care for his children, she stated. During my visits to his home, I observed unsafe living conditions, inadequate food supplies, and evidence of alcohol abuse. The children reported feeling scared and hungry, and both showed signs of emotional neglect. When it was David's turn to present his defense, Marcus Webb stood reluctantly. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he's been struggling since his wife abandoned the family. He's been working multiple jobs to support his children, and he admits he's made mistakes. But he loves his children and believes he can provide adequate care with some assistance. Webb called David to testify on his own behalf, and Linda watched. Her son walked to the witness stand with unsteady steps. Under oath, David admitted to drinking but denied being an alcoholic. He claimed he'd been working extra shifts to pay bills, not to avoid his children. He insisted that Emma and Jake were safe and happy in his care. Mr. Morrison, on January 23rd, when your son was injured at school, where were you? Sarah Kim asked. During cross-examination, I was at work, David replied. At which job? David hesitated. I had stopped for lunch. Where did you have lunch, Mr. Morrison? At Mulligan's Bar, David admitted quietly. And how many drinks did you have? During this lunch, David's attorney objected, but Judge Hoffman overruled him. Answer the question, Mr. Morrison. 2 or 3 beers, David said, his voice barely audible. 2 or 3 beers during a work lunch, which is why you were unable to answer your phone. When your 6-year-old son was hospitalized with a head injury, David didn't answer, and Linda felt tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't the man she'd raised, the father her grandchildren deserved. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Rodriguez, the guardian ad litem, had requested to present her findings directly to the court. Your Honor, I've spent considerable time with both children over the past month, she began. Emma and Jake are articulate, intelligent children who love both their father and their grandmother. However, their own words paint a clear picture of their living situation. Mrs. Rodriguez opened a folder and began reading. When I asked Emma what she worried about most, she said, I worry that Daddy won't come home, or that Jake will get sick and I won't know what to do. When I asked Jake about his happiest times, he said, when Grandma Linda reads us stories and makes us breakfast, she continued. Both children described nights when they were left alone, mornings when there was no food for breakfast, and times when their father was too sleepy to help them. Emma, at 8 years old, has taken on the role of Jake's primary caregiver. She makes his lunch when their father forgets, helps him with homework, and comforts him when he's scared. Judge Hoffman leaned forward, her expression serious. Did the children express any preferences about their living arrangements? Both children love their father and want to live with him, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. But when I asked them where they feel safest and most cared for, both immediately said Grandma Linda's house. Emma told me. Grandma always has food, and she helps us with homework. And she doesn't get scary when she's tired. Linda felt tears streaming down her face. These children, her grandchildren, had been forced to grow up too fast, to take care of themselves and each other because their father couldn't or wouldn't do it. Judge Hoffman called a brief recess, and Linda stepped into the hallway with Sarah. David was nowhere to be seen, but his attorney looked defeated. How do you think it's going? Linda asked. The evidence is overwhelming, Sarah replied. But judges don't like removing children from their parents unless absolutely necessary. She wants to see if there's a way to keep the family together. When court resumed, Judge Hoffman addressed both parties directly. This case presents a difficult situation. There's no question that Mr. Morrison loves his children, but love alone is not sufficient to provide adequate parental care. She turned to David. Mr. Morrison, the evidence presented today shows a pattern of neglect that has put your children at risk. Your alcohol use, irregular work schedule, and inability to maintain a safe home environment have created an unstable situation for Emma and Jake. David started to speak, but Judge Hoffman held up her hand. However, I also recognize that you've been struggling as a single parent without adequate support systems. The question before this court is whether these children are better served by remaining in their grandmother's care or returning to their father with appropriate interventions. Linda held her breath, knowing that the next words would determine her grandchildren's future. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, including the children's own statements and the professional recommendations of the guardian ad litem and social services, I find that Emma and Jake Morrison cannot be safely returned to their father's custody at this time. David's sharp intake of breath was audible across the courtroom. However, Judge Hoffman continued, I believe that family preservation should remain the ultimate goal. Therefore, I'm awarding temporary custody of Emma and Jake Morrison to their grandmother, Linda Morrison, with the following conditions. Linda felt relief and anxiety warring in her chest as Judge Hoffman outlined the terms. Mr. Morrison will have supervised visitation rights to afternoons per week and every other Sunday. Supervised by a court-appointed monitor, Mr. Morrison must complete a parenting skills class, attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings 3 times per week, and undergo random drug and alcohol testing. He must also maintain stable employment and housing for 6 consecutive months. Judge Hoffman looked directly at David. Mr. Morrison, if you successfully complete these requirements and demonstrate consistent sobriety and parenting capability, we will revisit custody arrangements in 1 year. The goal is to reunify this family, but only when it's safe for the children. She turned to Linda. Mrs. Morrison, you are hereby granted temporary legal custody of your grandchildren. The court recognizes your dedication to their welfare and your ability to provide stable, loving care. However, you are required to facilitate the father's visitation and to support the goal of eventual reunification if and when it becomes appropriate. As Judge Hoffman's gavel fell, Linda felt a mixture of triumph and heartbreak. She'd won custody of Emma and Jake, but at the cost of her relationship with David. Across the aisle, her son sat with his head in his hands, and she knew that despite everything, this wasn't the outcome she'd truly wanted. After the hearing, Linda found David in the courthouse parking lot, leaning against his truck and staring at the sky. David, she called softly. He turned to face her, and she saw tears in his eyes for the first time since Robert's funeral. I never wanted it to come to this, she said. I wanted to help you, not fight you. I know, David replied, his voice hoarse. I know you love them. Maybe you love them more than I do. That's not true, Linda said firmly. You love them just as much. You're just lost right now. David nodded, wiping his eyes. Can I see them tonight? Just to explain what happened. Linda's heart broke for him. The judge said supervised visits only. But David, if you do the work, the classes, the meetings, getting sober, this doesn't have to be permanent. What if I can't? David asked. What if I'm just not good enough to be their dad? Linda stepped closer to her son, seeing the scared little boy he'd once been. You are good enough. You're just hurting, and hurt people sometimes hurt the people they love. But you can heal, David. You can get better. 3 weeks later, Linda sat in her living room helping Jake with his math homework, while Emma practiced piano. The house felt fuller now, more alive, with children's laughter echoing through the rooms that had been too quiet since Robert's death. David had started attending his court-ordered programs, and Linda received weekly updates from his case worker. He'd had 2 supervised visits with the children, awkward affairs monitored by a social worker, but both Emma and Jake had been excited to see their father. Grandma Linda, Emma said, pausing in her piano practice, is Daddy going to get better? Linda looked at her granddaughter, seeing David's eyes in her young face. I hope so, sweetheart. He's working very hard to get better. I miss him, Jake said without looking up from his math worksheet. I know you do, honey, and he misses you too. That evening, after the children were asleep, Linda sat at her kitchen table and opened her journal. But instead of documenting problems and failures, she wrote about Emma's improved grades, Jake's decreased anxiety, and the stability that had returned to their lives. She also wrote about David's progress, about the hope she saw in his eyes during their brief conversations after his visits with the children. Recovery would be a long road, and there were no guarantees. But, for the first time in months, Linda allowed herself to believe that her family might heal. The judge had stepped in when Linda could no longer bear to watch her grandchildren suffer. But, perhaps, in time, love and determination could bring them all back together, stronger, healthier, and more grateful for the bonds that held them together. Linda closed the journal and looked at the family photos on her mantle, pictures of happier times when David was a devoted father and she was simply a doting grandmother. Those days might come again, but for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, standing guard over two precious children, who deserved nothing less than unconditional love and unwavering protection. The fight was over, but the healing had just begun.